June 18th, 2014. A warm, sticky evening in suburban Atlanta. The kind of night when porch lights glowed like tired eyes and sprinklers hissed rhythmically across manicured lawns. The Moore neighborhood was calm, predictable, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to each other at sunset. Inside a modest two-story brick home on Willow Lane, Evelyn Moore was finishing up the bedtime routine she'd followed for years. Her daughter Chloe, 10, had already buried herself under a pink blanket, and little Noah, just 7, insisted on one more bedtime story before he'd close his eyes. She smiled through exhaustion, her mind half on the story, half on the silence in the house. Her husband, Thomas, had left early that morning, saying he'd be home late. That wasn't unusual. His real estate business demanded constant dinners, calls, and deals that stretched long past midnight. Evelyn was used to it. In a way, that distance had become part of their marriage, like wallpaper she no longer noticed. She kissed her kids goodnight, whispered the same line she always did, "Mommy's right here." Then she descended the stairs, the house creaking softly under her bare feet. The air smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and the roast she hadn't finished eating. Outside, crickets sang against the hum of distant traffic. But something about that night felt off. The stillness carried a weight she couldn't name. Evelyn found herself glancing at her phone more than usual, waiting for Thomas's text or call, anything. The screen stayed dark. By 10:30 p.m., the neighborhood had gone quiet. The only light came from the street lamp spilling through her kitchen window. That's when it happened. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Evelyn froze, her pulse spiking. Who could be visiting this late? She straightened her robe, hesitated, and opened the door. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces lit by the blue pulse of a squad car parked at the curb. The younger one removed his cap, eyes soft but serious. "Mrs. Moore." Her throat went dry. "Yes. I'm Detective Adrian Cole, Atlanta PD. I'm afraid we have some difficult news." The words that followed would tear her world apart. "Your father-in-law, Harold Moore, was found deceased in his home earlier this evening." He paused, letting the silence land. It appears to have been a robbery gone wrong. For a moment, Evelyn didn't understand. The words didn't compute. Deceased, robbery, Harold. She blinked, trying to form a sentence, but only managed a whisper. "That can't be right. He was fine. I just saw him last week." The detective's tone was careful, practiced. "I'm very sorry for your loss, ma'am." Evelyn gripped the doorframe as her knees weakened. The porch light flickered above her. Behind her, she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock in the living room, every sound suddenly deafening. Outside, curious neighbors peeked through curtains. A car door slammed, and the blue-white lights from the cruiser cast eerie shadows across the front yard. Evelyn shook her head over and over, as if denial could rewrite reality. She couldn't make herself move. She didn't invite them in. She just stood there, barefoot on the hardwood floor, trying to breathe through the rising panic. Harold was gone. The man who'd sat at her kitchen table, drinking her coffee, telling stories about his years on the force, dead. Murdered. Across town, Detective Cole was already standing inside Harold Moore's small brick bungalow. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and copper. A single lamp cast a yellow cone of light across the living room. Blood had soaked into the carpet near an overturned chair. A drawer hung open, papers scattered, the kind of chaos meant to scream burglary. But to Cole, it didn't add up. He crouched near the body. Harold sat slumped in his armchair, 2 clean gunshot wounds to the chest. No sign of a struggle. No defensive wounds. No broken glass. The windows were locked. Cole studied the room carefully. The neat footprints on the tile, the strangely arranged clutter. Too tidy, he thought. Whoever did this had experience. Or worse, they knew exactly how to fake a crime scene. Back on Willow Lane, Evelyn sat alone in the dark. The officers had gone. The kids were asleep upstairs, unaware that their grandfather was gone forever. Her phone lay face up on the table, blank and silent. She stared at it, willing Thomas to call. But he didn't. Outside, rain began to fall, slow at first, then steady, tapping against the windows like a metronome counting down to something terrible. Evelyn pressed her hands to her face and whispered, "Please, let this not be real." What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that this wasn't the random act of violence police first suspected. This was personal, calculated, and it began not with a bullet, but with a secret buried 5 years earlier, a secret about love, betrayal, and the dangerous calm of a man who believed he could play God. The story of how everything fell apart didn't begin with a gunshot. It began 5 years earlier, with a funeral. In 2009, Harold Moore, a retired police officer and lifelong disciplinarian, buried his wife of 38 years, Loretta. The woman who had been his compass through every patrol, every sleepless night, every storm that life had thrown his way was suddenly gone. At the service, Harold stood ramrod straight, the way he had been trained as a young beat cop. He shook hands, nodded, accepted condolences with a stoic face. But everyone could see it in his eyes, the hollow space where purpose used to live. After Loretta's death, Harold's small brick house on Maple Drive became a museum of her memory. Her perfume lingered in the curtains. Her teacup sat untouched on the kitchen counter. He couldn't bring himself to move it. Nights were the worst, the silence, the echo of a house built for two. That's when Evelyn Moore, his daughter-in-law, began stopping by. She'd bring casseroles, fold laundry, tidy up the kitchen. At first, she did it out of kindness. She knew what loneliness looked like. She'd been feeling it in her own marriage for years. Her husband, Thomas, was a man married to ambition. Real estate deals, late-night negotiations, weekend networking trips. When he was home, he was still somewhere else, his mind in spreadsheets, his phone never out of reach. Evelyn used to joke that he had a better relationship with his Bluetooth headset than with her. So when Harold started visiting their home for dinner, it didn't feel strange. It felt right. A widower finding comfort among family. A daughter-in-law trying to fill the silence. At first, they talked about Loretta, the small things. The way she burned pancakes on Sundays. The song she hummed while ironing. Evelyn listened, truly listened, in a way that made Harold feel seen again. Then the topics changed. They started talking about life, about how fast it moves, how marriage can sometimes become a quiet routine. One evening, Harold said something that stayed with her. You think love dies when the body gets tired, but it doesn't. It just looks for another way to stay alive. Evelyn had smiled politely then, pretending not to understand. But she did, deeply. As weeks turned into months, Harold's visits became part of the rhythm of the Moore household. Every Wednesday, he'd stop by with groceries or a small toy for the kids. Every Sunday, he'd stay after dinner to talk with Evelyn on the porch while Thomas fielded work calls in the living room. The conversations stretched longer, their laughter softer, more intimate. They talked about dreams, his of fixing up an old boat and sailing to the Keys, hers of painting again someday, when the kids were older. It was innocent until it wasn't. One humid evening in August, Evelyn brought Harold a cup of coffee as they sat on the porch. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, just for a second. Neither of them moved. The air felt thick, electric. She pulled her hand away quickly, cheeks flushed. Harold looked at her, eyes full of something she didn't dare name. He left soon after, but that touch lingered. It was nothing, she told herself. Just two lonely people trying to make sense of loss. But she began to look forward to his visits in a way she couldn't explain to herself. She noticed his cologne, the way his eyes softened when he spoke. When the phone rang, and it was Harold, her heart beat a little faster. Meanwhile, Thomas drifted further away. He missed dinners, forgot anniversaries, brushed off her attempts to connect. When he did look at her, it was through her, as if she were part of the furniture in his carefully curated life. By winter, the boundaries between comfort and danger had blurred. Evelyn started keeping secrets she hadn't planned to keep, about where she went in the afternoons, about how often Harold stopped by when Thomas was gone. She told herself she was just helping, that she was giving a lonely old man company. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. Late one night, after putting the children to bed, she found herself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out at the quiet street. She saw Harold's car pass slowly, the headlights sweeping across the lawn. He didn't stop, just kept driving. But she stood there long after he was gone, trembling at what that small, silent moment meant. Evelyn didn't know it then, but she'd just crossed the first invisible line. And once you cross one, the next comes easier. In the months that followed, grief stopped being a shared emotion and became a tether between them, binding two people who should have kept their distance. It would be another year before the whispers turned into meetings, and the meetings turned into a secret. But by then, the damage was already done. Because when grief moves into a home, it doesn't always leave quietly. Sometimes it plants something darker, a seed of desire, guilt, and a tragedy waiting to bloom. By the time summer rolled into 2010, the boundaries between comfort and sin had vanished. What began as shared grief between a widower and his daughter-in-law had evolved into something far more dangerous, an emotional dependency that neither dared to name. Evelyn Moore told herself she was only helping Harold through his pain. But the truth was harder to admit. She needed him, too. In his presence, she felt visible again. Thomas barely looked at her anymore. Harold did, and he saw everything. Their connection deepened in silence. The glances across the dinner table lingered longer. The porch conversations stretched into the night. The air between them always carried a tremor, a tension both intoxicating and terrifying. One evening that fall, Thomas canceled dinner yet again. Evelyn found herself alone with Harold in the softly lit dining room. The kids were upstairs watching a movie, their laughter muffled behind the walls. Harold reached for the wine bottle, poured her a glass, and said quietly, "You shouldn't have to eat alone every night." His voice was low, almost apologetic. Evelyn smiled, trying to ignore the way her heart thudded against her ribs. That night, she walked him to the door like she always did. But when they hugged goodbye, it lasted one beat too long. She pulled back first, her breath shaky. Harold whispered, "I'm sorry," before stepping into the night. Neither of them slept. In the weeks that followed, their secret world began to form. Small, hidden moments stitched between the seams of ordinary life. Harold would stop by to check on the kids or fix a leaky faucet. Evelyn would pretend not to wait for him, though she always did. Each encounter felt more deliberate, more dangerous. A brush of the hand, a shared silence too heavy for words. By Christmas, she could no longer pretend it was harmless. But guilt didn't stop her. It only made every stolen moment feel more alive. By early 2011, they started meeting outside the house. It began innocently, a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a drive along the old back roads. Then came a motel. It was Harold's idea. "We can't keep doing this under the same roof as your children," he'd said. He was right. But even as she nodded, something inside her broke. Their first meeting was at a rundown in off Highway 92, the kind of place people drove past without noticing. Evelyn sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes before going inside. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, whispered, "This isn't me," and went in anyway. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old cigarettes. Harold was already waiting. When their eyes met, words failed. He crossed the room, and before either could think, their restraint crumbled. That night became a secret neither could escape. After that, secrecy became their addiction. They met in forgotten places, a decaying warehouse by the river, an abandoned theater with broken velvet seats, a foreclosed house that once belonged to one of Thomas's clients. Everywhere they went, they left no trace, except the growing shadow of their guilt. To Evelyn, those encounters felt like stepping out of her own skin. For an hour or two, she wasn't the obedient wife or the perfect mother. She was simply seen. But each time she returned home, the walls of her family life closed in tighter. She'd scrub her hands raw in the sink, try to wash away the scent of guilt. She told herself she could stop, that this was just a phase of loneliness, but deep down she knew it wasn't loneliness anymore. Harold, meanwhile, had become a man divided. The ex-cop in him knew the risk, not just moral but criminal. He told himself to end it 100 times, but every time he looked at Evelyn, he faltered. He started drinking more, isolating from old friends. He told his neighbors he was tired of being alone, but the truth was he was living a double life, one built on lies and late-night whispers. Each secret meeting was like walking a tightrope over an abyss. And yet they couldn't stop. The danger was part of the pull. One spring afternoon, they nearly got caught. They were parked behind an abandoned storage depot when a police cruiser rolled by. The flash of red and blue sliced through the broken windows. Harold's hand tightened on the wheel. Evelyn's breath hitched. The cruiser kept driving, unaware. But in that moment, both of them realized just how close they'd come to destroying everything. Harold turned to her, voice trembling. This has to stop. But they both knew it wouldn't. By the end of 2011, their affair had become an unspoken rhythm. Meetings, lies, guilt, and the unbearable silence of pretending nothing was happening. At home, Thomas remained blind, or maybe he just didn't want to see. To him, his father was a lonely widower, and his wife, a dutiful homemaker. The perfect facade. But beneath that facade, Evelyn's life was splitting in two. The woman she was and the woman she couldn't stop becoming. And while she told herself no one was getting hurt, the truth was that someone already was. She just didn't know it yet. Because Thomas More, beneath that polished smile and calm voice, had already begun to notice the cracks. And once suspicion took root in his mind, it would grow into something far deadlier than either Evelyn or Harold could imagine. By the spring of 2014, the Moore home had grown quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The air was thick with unspoken things. Long glances, awkward silences, and a faint hum of the marriage holding itself together out of habit rather than love. Thomas More had built his success on control. He managed clients, contracts, and negotiations with precision. He believed that with enough attention to detail, anything, even human behavior, could be understood, measured, and contained. But lately, Evelyn had become an equation he couldn't solve. At first, it was subtle. She started locking her phone, stepping outside to take calls, claiming they were from her sister or a friend. She'd dress up more when she went out. Just errands, she'd say. But the perfume lingered longer than usual. Thomas tried to ignore it. He told himself he was imagining things. People drift. Marriages go through phases. But every time he told himself to let it go, something inside him whispered, don't. One morning, while leaving for a meeting, he noticed Evelyn's car already gone, earlier than usual. She hadn't mentioned any plans. He checked his watch. 7:12 a.m. Something about the timing felt wrong. By the time he returned home that evening, the house was quiet again. The kids were a friend's sleepover, and Evelyn was upstairs folding laundry. She greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thomas felt the first flicker of suspicion harden into certainty. A week later, the truth revealed itself. Not in words, but in something small. Something ordinary. Evelyn had rushed out one afternoon, saying she had to pick something up from town. In her hurry, she left her purse on the kitchen counter. Thomas noticed it an hour later. He told himself not to look. But curiosity has a voice, soft, rational, persuasive. You have the right to know. He opened the purse. Inside were the usual things: lipstick, receipts, a photo of the kids. But at the very bottom, beneath a folded grocery list, lay a key, an old-fashioned brass motel key. The kind you only found in roadside inns from another decade. It wasn't from any of their properties. Not their house. Not his office. Not even one of his listings. His pulse quickened as he turned it in his hand. Stamped into the brass was a number. Room 12, Parkview Inn. He knew the place. A crumbling, low-end motel off Highway 92. The kind of place people went to disappear for a few hours. Thomas didn't need to be told what it meant. The next morning, he met an old acquaintance, Sam Porter, a retired cop turned private investigator. They met in a quiet diner on the edge of town, where no one would recognize them. Sam was built like an old bulldog, with the blunt patience of someone who'd seen too much. Thomas slid the key across the table. I need to know, Thomas said simply. Sam picked it up, studying the tag. You sure about this? Sometimes you find out things you can't unlearn. I'm already unlearning everything, Thomas replied. Sam nodded. Give me a few days. Those days felt like years. Thomas went through the motions of work and family life like an actor playing his own part. He smiled when spoken to, nodded through conversations, tucked his kids in at night. But inside, he was unraveling. He began to see Evelyn's every movement through new eyes. Every late return home, every nervous glance, every excuse, they all started to look like evidence. By the fourth day, Sam called. His tone was quiet, deliberate. "We need to talk." They met again in the same booth at the diner. Sam brought an envelope, thick, sealed. Thomas didn't open it right away. He just stared at it, feeling the weight of what it represented. "Pictures," Sam said softly. "From that motel." "I'm sorry, Tom." When Thomas finally tore it open, the world tilted. Inside were grainy surveillance photos. Evelyn and Harold entering the motel, their faces caught in half shadow. In one frame, she looked around nervously. In another, Harold's hand brushed her arm. Thomas's stomach turned cold. He flipped through the images slowly, his breathing steady but his eyes growing darker with each one. There was no doubt, no room for denial. The betrayal was complete, not just from his wife, but from his father. Sam's voice broke the silence. "You want me to dig deeper? Or do you want me to stop here?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He gathered the photos, slid them back into the envelope, and set it on the table. Then he looked up, calm, composed, terrifyingly still. "Don't stop," he said, "but don't call me again until you're finished." That night, Thomas went home, ate dinner with his family, kissed his children goodnight, and told Evelyn he loved her. She smiled, relieved, thinking maybe the tension had passed. But behind his eyes, something had already changed. The kind of change that doesn't come with shouting or rage, only silence. Cold, deliberate silence. Because Thomas More no longer wanted the truth. He already had it. Now he wanted control. When Thomas More discovered the truth, he didn't explode. He didn't confront his wife, or storm into his father's house, or shout for explanations that would only humiliate him further. Instead, something inside him went eerily calm, the way the air feels right before a tornado tears through. To the outside world, he looked unchanged. He went to work, closed deals, smiled politely in meetings. At home, he played with the kids, fixed the garage light, and complimented Evelyn's cooking. But beneath that calm, a storm was brewing, not of rage, but of calculation. Thomas didn't want a confession. He wanted control. He started small, the way a predator circles before it strikes. He invited Harold over more often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for no reason at all. "You shouldn't eat alone so much, Dad," he'd say with a smile. Harold would hesitate, but he always came. At the table, Thomas was the picture of warmth, pouring wine, asking about the grandkids, sharing jokes. But beneath every word, there was something else, a quiet undertone, a message only Harold seemed to hear. "Funny thing about loyalty," Thomas said one night, cutting into his steak. "It's fragile, isn't it? You think you can count on someone, and then, boom, it's gone." Harold's knife paused mid-cut. He forced a chuckle, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Evelyn. She looked down on her plate, her hand trembling just slightly. Thomas saw it all. Every flicker, every silence. He didn't need to say more. He just smiled and poured more wine. Over the following weeks, Thomas built his plan the way an engineer builds a bridge, one precise step at a time. He bought 3 small cameras online, the kind designed for discreet home security. He installed one behind the bookshelf in the living room, another in the garage, and a third in a small planter near the kitchen window. He also added recording software to the family computer, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. Every email, every text message, every call was captured. Evelyn never suspected. Why would she? Thomas's demeanor was so normal, it was chilling. He kissed her forehead each morning before leaving for work. He sent her small texts during the day. "How are the kids? Pick up milk?" The kind of ordinary communication that lulled her into false safety. But each word was a move in his silent chess game. At night, Thomas watched the footage alone in his office, sipping bourbon in the dark. The recording showed nothing explosive, no overt betrayal, but that didn't matter. He wasn't looking for proof anymore. He was looking for patterns, for tells, for the psychological rhythm of their guilt. And he found it. The slight tension in Harold's shoulders whenever Thomas spoke his name. The way Evelyn's laughter always died half a second too early when her father-in-law was around. The quick, anxious glances they thought no one noticed. They were already breaking under the weight of their secret. Thomas didn't need to expose them. He needed only to let their fear rot them from the inside out. One evening, he told Evelyn he'd be gone for the weekend, a business trip to Savannah. She kissed him goodbye, believing him. But Thomas never left town. Instead, he parked 2 streets away from his father's house, engine off, watching through the rain-streaked windshield. Hours passed before Harold's porch light flickered on, and Evelyn's car pulled quietly into the driveway. Thomas watched her step out, clutching her coat, pausing on the porch like someone who knew what she was doing was wrong. She knocked once. The door opened. She slipped inside. He sat there in silence, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough. At 2 a.m., when Evelyn finally returned home, Thomas was already in bed, feigning sleep. She slid under the covers beside him, trembling slightly. He could smell Harold's aftershave on her hair. He kept his eyes closed and whispered, almost tenderly, "Long day." She froze. "Yeah," she said softly. "Just tired." "Me too," he murmured. Over the next few weeks, Thomas intensified his quiet manipulation. He began asking Evelyn subtle, loaded questions. "You've been distant lately. Everything okay? You ever feel guilty about anything?" Strange how people change when they think no one's watching. Each question left her unsettled. Each silence afterwards stretched longer than the one before. Evelyn began losing sleep. She startled easily, grew short-tempered with the children, and avoided eye contact with Harold. The affair that once gave her life now filled her with dread. And that was exactly what Thomas wanted. He was no longer simply a betrayed husband. He was an architect of psychological collapse. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of silence was another turn of the screw. One night, as Harold prepared to leave after dinner, Thomas stood in the doorway and said with a polite smile, "Drive safe, Dad. You never know who's out there watching." Harold froze. Thomas held his gaze for one long second, long enough for the meaning to land, then turned away. When the door closed, Evelyn asked, "What was that supposed to mean?" Thomas shrugged. "Nothing. Just be careful." But both of them knew it meant something. Something chilling. Something final. By May 2014, the tension in the Moore family home was suffocating. Evelyn was unraveling. Harold was on edge. Thomas remained perfectly calm. Too calm. He had them right where he wanted them. Afraid. Isolated. Uncertain. He didn't need to pull the trigger yet. He just needed to make sure that when he did, they'd already be broken. June 18th, 2014, 8:47 p.m. The night the Moores' carefully constructed life finally collapsed began with absolute calm. The air was heavy with summer heat, the kind that made the crickets sound louder and the streets shimmer under the street lamps. Thomas Moore parked his black SUV 3 blocks away from his father's house, turned off the engine, and waited. He didn't bring rage with him. He brought a plan. In the passenger seat sat a small duffel bag, gloves, a handgun registered to Harold, and a handful of papers he had printed the night before. Photographs of Evelyn and Harold together at the motel, and letters written by Evelyn, printed from her private email. They were the final touches to a performance he had spent weeks rehearsing in his mind. He waited until the neighborhood was quiet, then stepped out. The sound of his shoes against the pavement was the only noise. Harold's porch light was on. Inside, the retired officer sat in his armchair, the TV flickering soft blue across his face. He didn't hear Thomas approach until it was too late. The door creaked open. "Tom," Harold called, startled, rising halfway from his chair. "What are you?" Thomas's face was unreadable. He stepped forward, eyes cold, movements deliberate. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Harold frowned. "This late?" Thomas didn't answer. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking like a lock on a coffin. What happened next lasted less than 20 seconds. Harold took one step closer. "Son, whatever this is." 2 flashes, 2 deafening cracks. The first bullet struck his chest, spinning him back against the armchair. The second hit as he fell, silencing him before his body hit the carpet. Then stillness. Thomas exhaled slowly, the calm of a man completing a task, not committing a crime. He stood over the body, eyes blank. "You took everything," he whispered. But there was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. 9:06 p.m. The staging began. Thomas put on latex gloves, wiping down every surface he'd touched. He dragged an old metal lamp across the room, knocking it over with a dull crash. A drawer was emptied, a few papers scattered, a chair overturned. Then came the details, the kind that make a crime scene believable. He took the handgun he'd brought, wiped it clean, and placed it in Harold's right hand. Then he set one of the photos, Evelyn and Harold at the motel door, halfway under Harold's arm. Another, folded neatly, he dropped near the couch. The goal wasn't subtlety. It was misdirection. He wanted investigators to find exactly what he left, just enough to believe the story. A robbery gone wrong, interrupted by a man hiding a secret affair. Before leaving, he paused at the door and surveyed the scene. The gun angled just right. The papers arranged like a confession written by the dead. The chaos carefully symmetrical. To an untrained eye, it would look spontaneous. But to Thomas, it was art, a composition of deceit. He turned off the lamp, leaving the room in half darkness, and stepped outside. 10:14 p.m. Thomas drove home through the sleeping streets of Atlanta. His pulse barely moved. At a stoplight, he checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, steady, expressionless. He thought about what he'd say when the police came. "I was home with the kids. Evelyn was upstairs. I didn't know anything until they called." By the time he reached Willow Lane, he had rehearsed it perfectly. Evelyn was still awake when he entered. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. "You're home early," she said, forcing a smile. "Yeah," Thomas replied softly. "Things wrapped up quicker than I thought." He poured himself a glass of water, his movements quiet, practiced. "You okay?" She hesitated. "Just tired. It's been a weird day." He nodded, looking at her just long enough for her to feel the weight of his gaze. "You should get some rest." She went upstairs, unaware that the man washing his hands at the sink had just washed away her world. June 19th, 2014, 7:22 a.m. The neighborhood awoke to sirens. Yellow tape fluttered in the morning heat. Neighbors whispered over fences as patrol cars lined the street outside Harold Moore's home. The word spread quickly. "Retired cop found dead. Looks like a break-in." Detective Adrian Cole stepped through the doorway, his eyes scanning the scene. To the younger officers, it looked simple: robbery, struggle, fatal shooting. But Cole saw too much symmetry. The overturned lamp, the scattered papers, the gun lying neatly against the right hand. It was all too deliberate, too composed. He crouched near the body. The wounds were clean, both at close range. There were no defensive marks, no broken glass, no forced entry through the windows. It was the kind of crime that looked like someone wanted it to look real. Back on Willow Lane, Evelyn's phone rang. Two officers stood at her door a few minutes later. "Mrs. Moore, we're sorry to inform you." The words hit her like a physical blow. She dropped to her knees, unable to breathe. The children ran to her, confused, frightened. Thomas stood behind them, his face perfectly composed, one hand on his son's shoulder. He whispered, "It's okay. I'm here." But even in that moment, his mind was already elsewhere, running through every step, every detail, making sure nothing had been left undone. He'd spent years controlling his family's life. Now, he had finally controlled its destruction. By sunrise, Detective Adrian Cole already knew something about the robbery at Harold Moore's house didn't sit right. Years in homicide had trained him to feel the temperature of a crime scene, and this one was too cold, too neat, too quiet. The first red flag was the gun. Harold's fingerprints were nowhere near the trigger, only on the grip, too clean, too controlled. Then came the wounds, two clean shots to the chest at close range, delivered with precision. Robbers don't shoot like that. And there was no forced entry, no broken window, no sign of struggle. Whoever had killed Harold hadn't come to steal. They had come to finish something. Detective Cole sat in his unmarked car that morning, flipping through the photos from the scene. One detail stuck with him. the folder of letters and photographs found beside the body. He stared at the image of Evelyn Moore with Harold, her face turned toward the camera in a grainy motel snapshot. It felt too convenient, too perfectly placed. Most killers tried to hide evidence. This one had gift-wrapped it. Cole closed the folder and muttered, "You're showing me what you want me to see." Meanwhile, back at Willow Lane, the performance had begun. Thomas Moore stood at the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee in hand, every gesture controlled. Neighbors came by with condolences. He thanked them softly, shaking hands, eyes wet but dry when no one looked. Evelyn, however, was unraveling. Her face was pale, her body shaking with guilt and grief she couldn't articulate. When detectives brought her in for questioning, she didn't fight it. She sat across from Cole in the interrogation room, hands trembling. "I didn't kill him," she said quietly. "I swear to God, I didn't kill him." Cole nodded. "Then tell me about your relationship with Harold." Evelyn broke. She confessed to the affair, describing it as a mistake that spiraled out of control. But when Cole pressed her on the night of the murder, her story was consistent. She'd been home all night. Cole believed her, not because he trusted her, but because her fear was too raw to fake. That left one other person, Thomas Moore. Cole visited Thomas later that day. The widower's son greeted him with polite detachment. "Detective," Thomas said evenly, "you have to understand my father wasn't the same after my mother died. He made choices that tore this family apart." Cole tilted his head. "And where were you last night?" "Home," Thomas said without hesitation. "I worked late, went to bed early. My wife can confirm it." He smiled slightly, as if he'd practiced it. Cole studied him for a long moment. Most grieving sons cried. Some raged. Others shut down. But Thomas looked like a man closing a deal, calm, careful, and utterly in control. When Cole left the house, he turned to his partner and said, "That man's either made of steel or guilt." Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation deepened. Every forensic test, every photograph, every piece of physical evidence was combed through again. The break came not from brilliance, but from routine. During a second sweep of Thomas's home, a junior detective found something insignificant looking, an old pair of work gloves tucked behind a toolbox in the garage. Cole ordered them tested. The results came back 2 days later. Microscopic gunpowder residue embedded in the fibers, matching the exact chemical composition of residue found at the crime scene. It wasn't much, but it was enough. On July 15th, 2014, police cars lined Willow Lane. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway as officers handcuffed her husband. Thomas didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. "Mr. Moore," one officer said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Moore." Thomas met his wife's eyes and said calmly, "It's over, Eve." There was no anger, no denial, only quiet satisfaction, the final move of a man who believed he'd still won. The trial that followed captivated Atlanta. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with surgical precision. The staged robbery, the planted photographs, the gloves, and, most damning of all, Thomas's own surveillance recordings. The man who'd spent months spying on his wife had inadvertently recorded himself plotting her destruction. In one clip, played for the jury, Thomas's voice could be heard saying, "I don't need to scream to punish them. Fear will do the work for me." Evelyn cried silently as the audio played. Detective Cole, sitting in the gallery, watched the crowd's faces shift from disbelief to horror. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a campaign of psychological warfare. After 10 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 5 hours. Verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence: life without parole. As the judge read the sentence, Thomas didn't flinch. He only adjusted his tie, the same small, controlled gesture he'd made 100 times before. Cole later said, "I've seen killers cry, I've seen killers curse, but I've never seen one look proud of the wreckage he made." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Evelyn. She said nothing. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. The only words she managed before being escorted away were, "He didn't kill out of love. He killed to prove he could." And with that, the performance was over. The puppeteer's strings had finally tangled around his own neck. The trial ended on a bright September afternoon, but for Evelyn Moore, The light outside the courthouse felt cruel, too sharp, too revealing. Reporters shouted her name as she walked down the marble steps, but she didn't look up. The cameras wanted tears, rage, closure. She had none left to give. Behind her, the man she'd once loved, her husband, the father of her children, was being led back into custody in handcuffs. Thomas More never looked her way. The chain clinked against the floor as he passed, calm and composed, as if the verdict had been another business meeting on his calendar. For months afterward, Atlanta couldn't stop talking. News anchors replayed courtroom clips on repeat. Talk shows debated whether Thomas was a cold-blooded psychopath or a man driven past reason by betrayal. But in the quiet corners of the city, at the playgrounds, in grocery store aisles, at the elementary school where Chloe and Noah returned, people whispered about Evelyn. She must have known something. She had it coming. She's lucky he didn't kill her too. The rumors followed her like shadows. She sold a house on Willow Lane. The walls still smelled of lemon polish and grief. Every corner reminded her of what she hadn't seen, of the mask she'd mistaken for stability. When she packed the last box, she found Thomas's old planner wedged behind a bookshelf. Inside, his handwriting filled the pages in precise, slanted rows, schedules, call notes, lists. But on one page, in the corner margin, a single line chilled her to her core. Control is the only form of love that doesn't fade. She closed the book and threw it into the trash. A month later, Evelyn and the children moved to Charleston, South Carolina, renting a small 2-bedroom cottage near the marshlands. It was quiet there. No reporters, no old friends, no reminders of Atlanta. The first night, the cicadas hummed outside, and the children slept soundly for the first time in months. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything, every small warning, every silence she'd ignored. She'd once thought the affair with Harold was her greatest sin, but now she saw it differently. That secret had been born of weakness and guilt. Thomas's secret, however, had been born of calculation, a darkness that studied her, mirrored her fears, and weaponized them. She'd been a piece on his chessboard long before she realized she was even in a game. In prison, Thomas adapted quickly. He kept to himself, read law books, and became something of a curiosity among inmates. Some saw him as intelligent, others as unnerving. The warden once told a reporter, "He's polite, well-spoken, never raises his voice. But when he looks at you, it's like he's measuring your worth." Thomas wrote letters to his children, polite, measured, almost sterile. He never mentioned the murder, only small talk, school, birthdays, lessons about discipline and composure. Evelyn never gave the letters to the kids. She kept them sealed in a shoebox, buried in a closet. One letter, though, she read only once. It was addressed to her. "Evelyn, I never hated you. I only wanted you to see the truth about loyalty, about how people trade affection like currency. I built something perfect once, and you cracked it, so I rebuilt it the only way I could, clean, unbroken, final. I hope the children grow up disciplined. Weakness makes people crueler than intent ever could." She tore it in half and burned it over the kitchen sink. The ashes curled into smoke and disappeared. Years passed. The world forgot the Moores. True crime podcasts retold their story in bite-sized, sensational episodes, complete with ominous music and dramatic narration. But for Evelyn, there was no episode-ending reflection, no closure, just survival. She got a part-time job at a small art supply store. On weekends, she painted, landscapes mostly, marshes, trees, empty roads. Her brushstrokes were soft, blurred at the edges, like memories seen through tears. Sometimes she caught herself humming the same song Loretta, Harold's late wife, once played on the piano. The melody haunted her, but it also reminded her that some ghosts don't disappear. They simply change form. In the spring of 2019, 5 years after the murder, Evelyn returned to Atlanta for the first time. She drove past the old neighborhood on Willow Lane. The house had been repainted. A new family lived there, children's bikes on the lawn, a dog barking in the yard. For a moment, she imagined her own kids riding those bikes, laughing in the sun, a world where none of this had ever happened. But that world was gone, burned down like everything Thomas touched. She parked outside the cemetery on Maple Drive and walked to Harold's grave. The grass had grown over the stone. She placed a single white lily down and whispered, "I forgive you." Then she drove to the state penitentiary. She didn't go inside. She just sat in the parking lot for an hour, watching the razor wire glint under the sun. Somewhere beyond those walls, Thomas was breathing the same air, methodically, evenly, unbothered. She didn't need to see him. She already knew what he'd look like. The same calm mask, the same detached eyes, the same man who once believed he could play God. But in that moment, Evelyn realized something he never would. Control isn't power, it's a cage. Thomas had built one for everyone around him, and now he was living in his own. That night, she returned to Charleston, tucked her children into bed, and stood for a long time by the open window. The salt air drifted in, carrying the smell of rain. She whispered softly to herself, not a prayer, not an apology, just a truth. The house may have burned, but I walked out of it alive. Outside, the marsh lights flickered like tiny stars over the dark water. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. The story that had once defined her was over. All that remained was the silence and the fragile, precious freedom she had built from the ashes.